So today's video is a slightly different one. It is a conversation, an interview that I conducted with the Reverend Professor Peter Storey. Peter is a very notable figure in South African church history, a former bishop of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, one of the leading figures in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And the interview was conducted at the occasion of the launch of Peter's autobiography, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes. The autobiography is called I Beg to Differ, Ministry Amid the Tear Gas, and it really is a wonderful book, well worth owning and worth reading, deeply inspirational. You'll hear my colleague Dr. Sipho Maukoto introducing Peter at the beginning of the interview, and then I invite you just to sit back, relax, enjoy Peter's charisma, his passion, and the way in which he thinks about the role of the minister, the function of the church in society, and particularly what a prophetic public theology might look like in South Africa and in other places as well. Just to mention, Peter was formerly also a professor at Duke Divinity School, and I had the opportunity of visiting him there and spending some time with Peter and Stanley Hawass and Richard Hayes and a number of others at Duke Divinity School, and you can certainly hear that he was one of the very challenging figures in that place. So enjoy the video. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear any comments and questions, any feedback, but I hope you enjoy this interview.
Without any further ado, let me introduce our Reverend here. Peter Storey is a former bishop of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa and a distinguished professor emeritus of Duke University in North Carolina. Once a chaplain to Nelson Mandela and others on Robben Island, he spent most of his 40-year ministry in inner cities, including District 6 and Central Johannesburg. He founded Lifeline South Africa and Gun-Free South Africa, and led the South African Council of Churches with Bishop Desmond Tutu when it was a fierce opponent of the apartheid state. Reverend Storey chaired the National Peace Accord body intervening in the pre-election violence in Witwatersrand, and after 1994 served as a member of the panel that selected the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He has preached and lectured in more than 160 cities around the world and now lives in retirement in Cape Town and sails on False Bay. He and his late wife, Elizabeth, had 4 sons who have produced 7 grandchildren. Professor, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Without any further ado, Professor Dion Forster is a Methodist priest and is always talking in methods. So he's a professor of at the Systematic Theology and Ecclesiology Department, teaching Public Theology and Ethics. He's also the director of the Beyers Naudé Centre. Professor Dion Forster, welcome. Thank you so much. He's a good professor. Now I'll give this time to you. The 30 minutes, it's exactly 5 to 1. Wow. Around 25 past I'll stand and give you a note where I will be taking some questions from the listeners. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sipho. Peter, thanks so much for being willing to participate in this book launch this afternoon, and I think this is a very fitting place for us to do it, in the chapel that occupies that space between the academy and the church, and certainly reading through your book, your autobiography, it's been a wonderful insight into the complexities that often exist between church and academy, but also between church and the world, and I hope we can unpack a little bit of that today as we go through. Just to mention, Peter was actually my bishop, and I might, if there's time, tell a story about how he once sent me home from a synod, but let's see how time allows. So Peter, I wonder if we can begin by, before we go into detail in the book, maybe just getting from you a little bit of the background. What brought you to this point of penning some of the story of your life? What brought you to writing this book, I Beg to Differ, which, by the way, I think is a wonderful title, and we'll unpack that as we go on.
Thanks, Dion, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a great honor to have you present and interested enough to come and explore with me a little bit about this book. People write autobiographies for many reasons, some of them not very worthy reasons, and I guess I carried this book in my head for about 20 years after I retired, and it just insisted on being written. But I think if you want to know the sort of reasons that drove me, I hope they were not selfish reasons. I think the first reason is that, you know, Jonathan Jansen reminds us that there's only one generation that can remember both 1948 and 1994 in South Africa, bridging the entire story of apartheid and liberation. I think there's an obligation on that generation, if they have any memories at all, to tell them. Because there's not just one memory, there's not just one narrative. Those in power, of course, would like us to think there is only one narrative, but there isn't. There's a kaleidoscope of experiences and contributions to the transformation of our country, and we need to hear them and read them all. That leads me to my next point, and that is that the struggle in South Africa was not waged by just one entity, one party, one language group, one race. There were people from every possible corner of South Africa's very diverse population who were engaged in that struggle, and they need to be lifted up and remembered. Thirdly, I don't think that the role of the church has been fully explored, and it won't be for a long time until people who were involved in the leadership and in other roles in the church can tell their stories. And so I see this book as something of a tribute to the church's role. It happens to be a Methodist telling the story, and it focuses rather on that denomination, but that doesn't matter. We're part of the ecumenical family, and we brought something, we hope, both strengths and weaknesses, both success and failure, to both courage and cowardice, to that struggle. So these are some of the reasons why I think books like this should be written, and hopefully will make a contribution to the big picture. There's one other thing I wanted to say, and I think Jansen also said this. There is only one generation that can say, I was there. And it just happens, and I think maybe this is one of the reasons why I felt I needed to write the book. I needed to write the book. For some reason, whether it was accident or whether it was the leading of the Holy Spirit, providence or whatever, I seem to find myself there in a number of places and times, and I actually just wrote them down. I'll read them very, very quickly, because there was, for instance, I was there when the last of the South African English lived. I was there at the destruction of mission education in this country. I was there on Robben Island when Nelson Mandela and the Rivonia prisoners and Robert Sobukwe arrived. I was in District 6 when the bulldozers came. I was the editor of a newspaper covering about 10 years of the history of the Methodist Church during the apartheid years. I was there in leadership of the SACC struggle I was there in that dreadful chapter in the life of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and I was there at the birth of the TRC and in the launching of the Peace Accord. So just for some strange reason, I seem to find myself placed in a number of those spaces just at the time when infamous and notorious things were happening. So it is an eyewitness account to a large degree, and I think those such accounts are important to record.
Now, Peter, thanks very much for that. You mentioned in what you were sharing with us now one or two things that I think are interesting and relate, I think, to the title of the book, I Beg to Differ.
I think they're all interesting.
They're all interesting. Yes, you're right. It made for a very interesting read. But the title of the book is I Beg to Differ. And I must say, as a minister of the Methodist Church, as one of your former colleagues colleagues in the Methodist Church, that was one of the things that always struck me, was your capacity sometimes to see what no one else was seeing, your willingness even to engage, to differ, to be willing to confront. And in the telling of your story, you related back to what you mentioned earlier, the fact that you were an English-speaking person in South Africa. I wonder if you can touch on just one or two of those aspects of your life where you experienced difference and how that informed your theology, your ministry, your witness.
Yeah, well, just to touch on the Englishness, I mean, I came from 1820 settler stock. I was a 7th generation Methodist minister in my family, but we carried in our bloodstream and in our DNA both, I think, the strengths and the profound problems and weaknesses and sins of British colonialism and its history. And so, to cut a very long story short, I grew up, I was a child who stood waving a flag when the King and Queen swept past in their black Daimlers in 1947, when I think Jannie Smuts thought he might manage to win an election if he brought the King and Queen and the princesses out here to seduce the population. Well, they didn't quite do that, and he failed. But that's my history. I won't go into it all, except to say that I believe that everybody has got to repent of their culture at some point or another. There are elements within every culture that need to be repented of. In mine, certainly, and we've been reminded very loudly and increasingly about that, I think, in the present era, quite rightly, because we focus so much on apartheid, that we forgot what came before apartheid was colonialism of a very destructive sort, if there aren't any other kinds, I don't think. But and so there came for me, and I recorded in the book, a moment when that realization came upon me, and I found myself standing in Westminster Abbey in London, which you might say is probably the spiritual heart of all that is British, weeping as I looked at the statuary around this. I was very proud and very moved by the tombs of the poets and the great spiritual leaders and the people who struggled for human rights, like William Wilberforce and others. But the really large statues were all reserved for generals and admirals who had spilled blood all over the world. And they were my ancestors. And I had to accept some responsibility for that. And I found myself repenting for big chunks of my culture while I celebrated other parts of my culture. So I'm not interested in identity theology very much. I find it poisonous. I believe that I'm a citizen of a kingdom, and you'll pardon the use of that word, but I haven't found a better word for it yet, which comes from another place and brings other values and stands in judgment over all cultures. So I believe rather in Christ over culture rather than Christ in culture. I haven't found much in culture that is all that exciting. And so it would seem to me that the most important thing the church can give to the world is to be different from it. That's all we have to offer, is the difference. If we have no difference, we have nothing to offer. We need to be able to offer an alternative. The title, I Beg to Differ, comes from a little poem which touched me many years ago and which I have repeated to myself almost every morning as part of my devotion. A candle is a protest at midnight. It is a nonconformist. It says to the darkness, I beg to differ. And it would seem to me that the role of the church, particularly in the era through which I lived, was to say to what was happening in our country, we beg to differ. And to proclaim that. And then to try, often very imperfectly, to live that. I don't think it's changed much.
Yeah, yeah. Peter, that the introduction of the book where you speak about your childhood and the role that your father played as a Methodist minister and how his ministry at Kilnerton had awakened you to some of the injustices, racial injustices, political injustices in our country. That seems to me to have been one of the very first awakenings in your life. But once you had come into ministry, once you had responded to the call of Christ into ministry, it seemed to me that one of the next very important milestones for you was when you saw the opportunity to sail to Robben Island once a week. Maybe tell us a little bit about how your love for the sea and for sailing brought you into contact with Robben Island, and how that awoke you to a political cause, a form of ministry that sought to bring change.
Well, I would love to give the impression that it was some commitment to justice and all those kind of things, and compassion for that took me to Robben Island. But when our superintendent minister said to us in a staff meeting that they're building a prison on Robben Island and they need a chaplain, which one of you guys is interested? And I said, I'll go. And the reason was that I'd come out the Navy, I was missing the sea, I longed to get back on the water, and I thought to myself, at least I'll sail across to the island regularly. It was once a month actually, not once a week. And so that was, I suppose, the very unimpressive motive that took a very young minister, far too inexperienced for the job, to Robben Island. None of us knew at that time it was going to be a political prison. And I'd been there 18 months already when, and the person who impressed me most was Robert Mangalisu Sobukwe. The reason for that, partly, is because I was able to have one-on-one time with him. He was a Methodist lay preacher. He was not allowed to see anybody else except a doctor. So I was the only other visitor he had at that time, to my knowledge. And he took his membership of the church very seriously indeed. So we were able to sit down one-on-one in the little hut where he lived on the island, not the one that you are shown now. It was a wooden hut closer to the sea. And just a guard would stand in the corner, obviously listening, and we were not allowed to discuss politics. But the point is, when you discuss theology, you're discussing, it cannot be anything but political in its impact ultimately on the world. Otherwise it's not theology. And so we were able, after a measure of trust had been established, and I want to say there was no reason for him to trust me, this young white kid, but he was very gracious. A very gracious man, very quiet, very contained, not full of talk, thoughtful. We both smoked pipe, so we spent a lot of time lighting our pipes and puffing smoke into the air while we talked. We had a joke at that time because I used to bring him tobacco. And I said to him, I'm bringing you 3 nuns tobacco because that, it's very lonely here. No woman around. The best I can do is 3 nuns. But here for the first time, I had already met some giants, like William Cornwall, for instance. When we were at Kilnerton, he was our family doctor. But here was somebody who was so clearly head and shoulders intellectually and morally above me and above so many, locked, immobilized, cut off from the contribution he could make to our country. And then when Mandela and the others came, the same impression, although I was not given nearly as much access to them. If you can imagine this, you've been to Robben Island. If you haven't been, then something wrong, you should do that. But if you can imagine the passage, you can imagine this passage here, and the cells on each side. All they did was open the wooden doors. They wouldn't open the barred doors, and I had to walk up and down, and I had to look into each cell as I tried to preach and as I tried to lead worship. But the important thing to me was the reception and the welcome these men gave me, including Ahmed Kathrada, the Muslim amongst them, very gracious. And the fact that they were all mission educated, which meant that they knew all the hymns backwards. We didn't need hymn books. We could sing and lift the roof. And Nelson Mandela among them, at that time a young, vigorous, he seemed to me like a coiled spring. But everyone welcomed me. And again, the contrast between being among these clearly remarkable human beings and then traveling across the water and back to the Camps Bay Methodist Church, which was a pretty narrow-minded bunch who were far more interested in talking about, whether if a donkey dies it goes to heaven and things like that. The contrast was enormous. And I think that became an enormous tension in me. And I knew where I was doing the most relevant work and where it seemed to me the gospel was most real. It was most real in the suffering of those people on that island. I also preached in that church, which you may have seen, beautiful old stone church, but everything had been ripped out of it. No chairs, no pews, no altar, no pulpit, utterly bare, so that when the common law prisoners and the more junior politicals came in there for a service with me, that place was meant to convey coldness and rejection to them. And it was my job to try and bring warmth and some cracks of hope. I grew up, I think, quite fast because of Robben Island. Very grateful for it.
Yeah. Peter, thanks for that. I mean, if we had much more time, I'd love to have talked a little bit about your time in Australia, in Sydney, but I'd like us to focus again on your return. When I was reading through the book again over the weekend, I came across those 3 convictions, the 3 statements that you developed on your return to South Africa that you really saw as the core of the work of a minister. And just to say, this was one of the things that I've experienced in you and come to know in you, that you never saw yourself as a politician, but always only as a minister of the gospel. And that, there were political elements to that. But these 3 things, I think, shaped so many of us in our ministries. I just read them back to you. You said that you developed these 3 guidelines in 1964 to witness to the truth, to bind up the broken, and to live the alternative. And that these became shaping convictions for your ministry. Could you tell us a little bit more about those three convictions and how they guided you in your ministry after 1964?
Yeah, well, thank you. They are so important to me, but there was a fourth. There was a fourth. Go back and have a look, Dion. I think you'll find there was a fourth. But it doesn't matter.
Tell us the fourth.
We had gone to Australia for me to study city ministry, urban ministry, in what was then, I think, the most amazing city church anywhere in the world, the Central Methodist Mission in Sydney, Australia. And at the end of those 2 years, there was a mini crisis in our lives because we were invited to stay and not to return to South Africa. And there was some good reason not to, because that was the year in which Verwoerd was assassinated. Forster came into power with an even more sort of concrete stone heart in terms of intensifying apartheid and detentions without trial and things like that. So there was quite a strong temptation with having two little boys at that time, knowing that at some point they might be called into the army and so on. But we had given our word to come back, and that for me, it was all that counted, and we had to go back, no matter how attractive it would be maybe to stay there. And it was at that point that in my prayers and in my thinking, I was asking myself, all right, if we do go back, what kind of minister, what are the priorities for ministry in this South Africa, which is sliding down into violence and darkness? And it came to me that what kind of church, and of course I'd been reading Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church and so on, and I had to give a talk when I left, a public talk, which was called Which Way South Africa? And that's where I said South Africa needs a confessing church. That's where we will be going. We will have to become a church under the cross, and these are the priorities that we will have to be faithful to. The first is to tell the truth without fear and without favor, to expose the lie. Tell the truth and expose the lie. That is what that's what got Jesus crucified. That's what took him to Jerusalem, to expose the truth in a city that lived by the lie. The second is to bind up the broken. Now, many of my Marxist friends would argue that that was a waste of time, that you should actually let people suffer more so the revolution would come sooner. And my response was always, well, that may be good politics, good ideology, but it's bad theology. It's bad Jesus. If Jesus had a much bigger job than changing South Africa, he was here to save the world. And yet, he never hesitated to stop and pause and spend time with somebody who was in pain, somebody in need, somebody who needed healing. And a church that is not willing to get down with the sufferers and bind up the broken has no right to speak. That's the platform which gives us the authority that we live in identity with those who are suffering. The third was to live the alternative. There are very few people with vision in this world, I've discovered. Most people need to be given a vision very clearly. They need visual aids before they understand what is meant by many of the things we preach. And therefore the church needed to become a visual aid. And if South Africa was all about segregating people, the church needed to be about bringing people together. People needed to be able to look at the church and see a picture of the South Africa God wanted. And it needed to dwell amongst them. It needed, like Jesus, to be incarnated amongst them. So to live the alternative to what we were being told to live like. The final one, which Dion didn't quite see,
75%.
was to. The final one is very important. The final one was to seek the downfall of evil and the establishment of justice. in Christ-like ways, in ways that were in conformity with the mind of Christ. And of course we could talk forever about the differences and discussions we had about methods that some thought were in conformity with the mind of Christ and others perhaps felt were not. And so issues of violence and all those other things came up under that discussion. But the church needed to be engaged in that struggle as church.
Now, Peter, just touching on this last point, which I missed. I mean, one of the characteristics of your ministry is that theologically you saw yourself as witnessing to the gospel in a peaceable manner, living for a kind of kingdom that was structured not by violence but by peace. And we know that there were, often that was a very costly stand to take. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe also a little bit about those two important initiatives that you founded, the Gun-Free South Africa campaign and your work with the Peace Initiative leading up to the 1994 elections and beyond.
Well, thank you. This is where many people will say I just get completely unrealistic, but I would want to suggest that the most long-standing sin of the church was its love affair with violence, its compromise with violence. That is the most long-standing, at least. For 300 years the church was pacifist. For 300 years you could not serve in the army if you were a Christian, the Roman army. And then Constantine got into the act. God help us when the politicians get into the act, things go rotten very quickly. And that's when the church became colonized by the state. And that's where we lost our integrity, especially when it came to the compromise with war and violence. So I stand in the tradition of Jesus, in the tradition of Gandhi, in the tradition of King, and say that until the church completely turns its back on the use of violence, we will be failing one of the most important areas of witness. And one of the, we are supposed to side with life, not death. Jesus came that we may have life, not death. And so I believe that the true heroes, if you like, of the history of the church are those small groups of Christians like the Quakers and the Mennonites and others who have stood willing to die rather than take life. And we have them amongst us. We had amazing young men, young white men, who said, I will die, but I will not kill. And don't tell me that I'm not just telling you I won't fight for apartheid. I won't fight for anything else either. I won't kill for liberation either. It's not just one or the other. It's both. And so, yeah, I respect deeply. I came out of the military. That was going to be my career. I have a deep understanding of those people who wear uniforms and are often sent to do very ugly things by fat, old, bald politicians who never pay a price. And it was interesting, if you go back to the apartheid years, you look where the sons of Botha, Malan, and all the other big mouths of the so-called onslaught, the struggle against communism, their sons were all in safe, non-military positions in the army or the air force or whatever. So there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy at the political level. I have a lot of respect for people who are willing to go and do something which they never wanted to do. And so my argument, for instance, about military chaplaincy in the Methodist Church was that we must oppose the war, but we must make sure we do not abandon those kids, those 18-year-olds who have not yet formed their ethical and theological clarity, who are being pushed and used as mincemeat. But we must also minister to the other side, and so on. So I tried to put while I understood completely the position of people who took another view, the so-called Christian soldier view, if you like, or the when we tried to make the Methodist Church into a peace church, it was the one time we made everybody angry. The whites said, you want us just to lie down and let the communists run over us? The blacks said, you want us to lie down and let these Buddha run over us? Come on! Peacemaking makes a lot of people angry. It touches us on the raw, whoever we are. So for me, the Peace Accord was an amazing instrument designed to help us find our transition with the least possible bloodshed. I still regard the National Peace Accord as a model for the world, and I don't think it's been given anything like the credit that it should receive, because the politicians weren't involved. They were their hands were too dirty on all sides. It was the church and ordinary people who came together. 26,000 young black kids from the townships who had lived under violence became our peace monitors. And with enormous courage, they went and stood between warring groups. They looked down the barrels of rifles. It's an amazing story, that. And it's one of the best kept secrets of our transition. I don't know.
I remember.
We're going to get closed down.
I remember. I've seen the moderator already, but I remember when Peter, who was our bishop then, decided that every Methodist minister needed to spend 1 day a week in peace work, and I was sent into Khutsong and Kokozi between. In a very volatile situation, wearing only a blue bib with a little dove on it, and somehow it was effective. It was respected. Yeah. Peter, just to say to the folks who are here, obviously we couldn't cover everything. The book is 300 Rand. It's worth it. Buy it. You'll read about an incident with Billy Graham, which I thought was very interesting, and spoke about the differences between different kinds of views of the gospel long before Kairos had spoken about church theology and prophetic theologies. There's, for those of us who are involved in theological education, the last chapter speaks about the formation of persons for ministry and the future of the church in our country. So there really is some wonderful stuff to read. Peter, I want to ask you, just as a last word in the interview, we're approaching the elections on the 8th of May. And the church in South Africa is finding itself in a fairly complicated and difficult position. This is outside of the book, but what might be some words that you would give to us as an audience? Many of us here are Christian who are preparing ourselves and our members for elections on the 8th of May.
Well, I would want to say that I do not believe that those 4 priorities that were hammered out, if you like, in the furnace of the heat of the anti-apartheid struggle are out of date at all. I believe they're absolutely current. That it doesn't matter who Caesar is. Caesar happened to be, in those days, white, largely Afrikaner leadership of this country, propagating an ideology of apartheid, and white English enjoying the fruits of it. Now Caesar is a different color, and Caesar has a different history, but Caesar is still Caesar. Nothing changes the DNA of Caesar. He may be more polite and friendly at times, and easier to get along with and sympathetic, but he's always will be Caesar. And therefore, we must never put our eggs in the Caesar basket. We must realize that that whoever comes into power, within a political power in a country, They are, it's the word is escaping me. I don't have such good vocabulary anymore. But therefore, we're always going to be voting for something relative. We're certainly not. Democracy is not the kingdom of God. Democracy is one of the imperfect ways in which human beings have tried to order society. As Winston Churchill says, it's the worst form of government, in the world, except for all the others. And he's absolutely right about that. We choose democracy not because it's perfect, but because it's least imperfect, if you like. And so we mustn't put our hopes too high. But we have an obligation. We have an obligation to hold political leadership to standards which we have been called by God to proclaim. And it doesn't really matter whether they are Christian or not. It doesn't matter. We come from that place, and we claim the right, just as the business chamber claims the right to talk on behalf of business, and we're going to talk on behalf of Jesus and his kingdom values. And we're going to recline. Now, I know at the moment there's a real dilemma. Who do we vote for? And there are some people saying, well, Robben Island is a reformer, and we can see that he's already put into place a number of clean-up operations, but he's holding power by just a whisker, so we should strengthen his hand, and we should vote for him. I would have to say I cannot do that until he kicks out of the voting of the candidates list every crook I know. And you know, and we all know. There are a number of crooks there who, if they're on that voting, I have voted ANC, but I will not vote for his party unless he has the courage to say to Gagaba, to Dlamini and all these others, you're out. Because you smell of corruption. You may not have had it proved yet, but you compromise us. On the other hand, there are others who would say, vote for one of the smaller parties and hope that maybe we can end the domination of one party which has made it fat and corrupt. And therefore it needs to go. And so try and get a coalition maybe that would make more than 50% of the vote. I'm not here to tell anybody how to vote. But I am here to say that well, I've already said you can't vote for a party that refuses to remove from its ranks people who are obviously bad, crooked. So I don't know how to, but what I want to turn it on its, when Jesus came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, the interesting thing to me is, although he had called Herod a fox, although he had annoyed the Romans, although he was clearly heading for a political execution, when he rode into Jerusalem, well, let's imagine him going down Philip Hosanna Drive, okay? And you would expect him to stop at the state president's house? No, marched on. What about Parliament? No, he went right past. That was a surprise. And then St. George's Cathedral, he gets off. And he goes inside and he kicks everybody out. Grote Kerk, he gets off, he kicks everybody out. Central Methodist Mission, even the Central Methodist Mission, he goes inside and kicks everybody out. My concern is not so much to the discussion about who people should vote for. My concern is what kind of church is engaging the state right now. And I think the church is probably as badly disrespected at the moment as it has been for 100 years. And it's because we tolerate in our midst people who give Jesus a very bad name. We tolerate these satin-suited televangelists with their private jets who tell the lie that being Christian brings you prosperity. We tolerate these demagogues in the townships who exploit the ignorance of simple believers by calling themselves prophets and apostles. We tolerate Christian ministers who become chaplains to political parties, as if they're baptizing those political parties. We tolerate having politicians coming to our churches on a weekend, as they did last week, an Easter weekend, to tell us why we should vote for them. That's a disgrace. How dare they come into God's house and try and sell their Caesar's trinkets to us. This is what we are tolerating. We tolerate churches that are busy organizing for certain politicians. Our hands are very, very dirty. Our job is to be church. And when we are really church, then we can tell the state how to be the state. Let God be God. Karl Barth was not wrong. And at the moment, I think we're a very confused community. Sorry.
Let's thank Peter. So thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it meaningful. How embarrassing that I missed one of the 4 points of Peter's view on how a ministry in South Africa for justice and possibly in the world can be shaped. But yeah, it was for me really a meaningful time to speak with a colleague, my former bishop, and someone who's had such a significant impact on my life. So just to remind you again, you can get your copy of the book. I know it is available on Kindle. I actually own it on Kindle and in a paper copy. The book is called I Beg to Differ, Ministry Amid the Tear Gas, and I'll put a link to where you can get it in the show notes. So please leave a comment if you found this useful, any questions that you may have, and I invite you to subscribe to this channel for other interviews. There are interviews with people like Rowan Williams, Fritz de Lange, professor from Holland, Torsten Meyerreis, a professor of ethics from Berlin. So a number of notable persons, theologians that we've interviewed over the years, lectures and various thoughts in theology. So please do subscribe to the channel. I'd love to stay in touch with you. And as always, thanks for watching.